Merci de nous accorder la possibilité de comparaître devant vous. Les amis ont changé de place avec Shaw suite à un problème d'horaire déclenché par le décès inopportune de Paul Robertson. Unfortunately, the chair of our governing body, Dr. Noreen Golfman, who's the provost and vice president academic at Memorial University, could not rearrange her schedule on short notice to join me here today. Peter Miller, author of the Environmental Scan and Canadian Program Rights Studies that you've already been discussing, is at my side in case you have any questions about those studies, because we are one of those co-sponsors. Defining a regulatory framework for the future of Canadian television is a complex assignment. In its 1999 TV policy, the Commission noted that given the scope, complexity, and pace of change, it is difficult to predict the exact nature of those changes and how and when they may have an impact. Prescient words. In essence, we have 4 messages for you. First, do no harm, or when in doubt, do nothing. You owe it to viewers and listeners to take the time to get it right. Second, do not look on viewers and listeners only as consumers. In the words of Sonia Livingston, the promise of media literacy, surely, is that it can reposition the media user from passive to active, from recipient to participant, from consumer to citizen. 3, lay out a vision of a dynamic, functioning, and contributing broadcasting system and a regulatory framework to support it. Focus on topics that require immediate attention, such as the plight of local broadcasting in small and medium markets, or the future of important but vulnerable specialty channels such as Treehouse, or protecting Canadian content, or the importance of the long-term viability of the CBC SRC. Lay out an agenda of focused future proceedings to address priority issues and report to government publicly on the state and stakes of Canadian television. And 4, any regulatory framework arising from this proceeding should have a sunset of possibly 3 or 5 years. Peter Miller's scan presents, to our way of thinking, convincing evidence that our system has great potential to thrive within that time frame. You should identify exceptions and proceed to address them with care. Now, we wish to comment on 4 topics. The first is the role of the national public broadcaster. CBC SRC is the only non-vertically integrated service with the experience and resources to provide programming of public interest across all platforms from coast to coast to coast in both official and also Aboriginal languages. As private broadcasters face increased pressure at the local level, CBC SRC can leverage its combined resource of radio, TV, and digital to provide appropriate local content to fill the gap. In a sea of foreign and vertically integrated TV voices, CBC SRC is a crucial independent and potentially non-commercial voice, valuable for maintaining a distinct country on the northern half of the North American continent, and essential for predominantly and distinctively Canadian programming in a variety of genres. In other words, essential for a system that, to quote your notice, encourages the creation of compelling and diverse Canadian programming. But to do this, CBC SRC must be empowered to play a much larger role. It is within your powers to do 3 things to build this capacity. 1, substantially reduce the CBC SRC's draw on the ad market. 2, allocate 1%, eventually growing to 2% of BDU revenues to CBC SRC. And 3, direct Netflix and other OTT operators to contribute 5% of their Canadian revenue to support CBC SRC. We've outlined these proposals in greater detail in our June 27 submission, and that includes your advising government on the crucial importance of financing CBC SRC. Second, the relevance of the new media exemption order. No one can sit here and credibly assert that new media, including over-the-top, remain merely complementary and pose no threat to broadcasting licensees' capacity to meet their obligations. You should revisit the order to determine what contribution OTT services and other foreign-based TV players should be mandated to make in order to conform to the requirements of the Broadcasting Act. Third, a word about simultaneous substitution. For 42 years, simulcasting has protected the rights purchased by Canadian broadcasters while avoiding the blackouts that are, from a viewer's perspective, the scourge of rights protection south of the border. The Armstrong study indicates that simulcasting boosts system revenue by as much as $458 million. That's a year, close to 25% of conventional TV revenue. What is at stake is production values, and in small and medium-sized markets, the risk of station closures. We find the coalition of small market independent television stations arguments persuasive and alarming. That's why Friends recently commissioned a Nanos poll of 500 respondents to gauge public opinion in communities at risk. Nanos interviewed 100 persons in 5 new federal ridings, that is, the ridings that will operate in the forthcoming general election. Each one considered a swing riding: St. John's, Mount Pearl, Ottawa West Nepean, Hamilton West, Ancaster Dundas, London West, and Thunder Bay Rainy River. And the results: 81% consider local news valuable. 77% would care if local news were to stop. 71% think the CRTC should avoid regulatory changes that would undermine their local TV station. 89% think their MP should work to keep local broadcasting strong, and 79% think local news contributes to making their community stronger. These data align with the Nanos Research Survey of 1,000 Canadians we commissioned with ACTRA and Unifor, which found that 95% of Canadians consider local news important. As you know, the coalition indicates that its 9 members, 19 stations in 13 markets are even more dependent on simulcasting than larger stations, and the Commission should also be concerned with the viability of the CTV2 network once Bell's regulatory obligation to maintain it expires. The elimination or even reduction of simulcasting is a dangerous idea that should not receive serious consideration. And fourth and finally, unbundling our pick and pay, which was first broached in the October 16, 2013 throne speech. The next day, Canadian Heritage Minister Shelley Glover commented in the House of Commons, and I quote, "Canadian families work hard to make ends meet, and every dollar counts. Our government believes Canadian families should be able to choose the combination of television channels they want and will require channels to be unbundled while protecting Canadian jobs." On the other hand, you, Mr. Chairman, have recently been quoted as saying, "I've never promised that pick and pay would be cheaper." According to Nanos research, 62% of Canadians agree. They believe major cable and satellite providers who have advised your Commission that pick and pay will not reduce consumer prices, and 24% believe Minister Glover. The environmental scan reports on U.S. studies suggesting an impact as high as a 50% loss of channel revenues. Even Mr. Miller's more conservative estimate of 20% reduction in subscription revenues suggests that pick and pay is not the kind of gamble that a prudent CRTC would take with the future of the Canadian broadcasting system. You have indicated that you would still require some form of basic package. Unless you were to abandon the principle of predominance of Canadian services, which in our view would be illegal, Canadians would still have to pick Canadian channels paired with U.S. channels, and fundamental economic principles dictate that if everyone picked fewer channels, the per-channel cost would rise. How would unbundling make the system stronger or create more or better Canadian programming? None of this would further the objectives of the Broadcasting Act. It is essential that your Commission study the options carefully, as it has in the past, to ensure the vitality of our carefully constructed broadcasting ecosystem. Adopting an ill-conceived, focus group-generated proposal would do a disservice to all Canadians. And once Canadians experienced the results, they would know whom to blame. On both the simulcast and pick-and-pay files, you should take care to avoid oversimplification of arguments and, most of all, unintended consequences. Le sondage Nanos démontre que les décisions du Conseil au fil des années vous ont mérité la confiance de près de 2/3 des Canadiens quant à la protection de la culture et de l'identité canadienne. Nous vous demandons de faire attention de continuer de mériter cette confiance soigneusement gagnée. Merci de votre écoute.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais demander au conseiller Simpson de commencer les questions.
Sure, Mr. Simpson.
I was just saying it's nice to see you again, Mr. Morrison, and you too, Mr. Miller. I haven't seen you for ages.
That seat was warm, Mr. Simpson.
Mr. Hennessy, before you had said something that I'm going to add to, and it just sets the tone for some of my questions. He said the business of broadcasting is a money-making business, and that the business of program production is a money-making business. And I put it to you that in the perfect world of Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, if it was up to you, public broadcasting would not be a money-making business. It would be out of the commercial side of the business. But the question that's before us that looms large, even though we're going to get into nation building and the rest of it, is that the money for public broadcasting comes from the commercial side of broadcasting, as does the money for program production. And that model's changing. And the question I think that all of us are plagued with is how fast is it changing and what will it look like? So where I'd like to start is by asking you whether you think that the notion of having regulation move and chase the digital side of the business, the online side, the on-demand side of the business, and going into the sphere of regulating that is a solution, or is the solution possibly letting the privates do what the privates seemingly do well, which is compete with this new competition on a level playing field where there's actually relaxed regulation that allows them to compete and still make the profits that contribute to public broadcasting and production?
Well, Commissioner Simpson, you tossed a question at me that might tempt me to answer as long as Michael Hennessy, but I'll try to be brief.
Thanks.
And number one, the reference to public broadcasting at the beginning of that. SRC Radio Canada has been described, I think, accurately as if it's a money-making organization, it has a loss every year in the range of $1.something billion. It's a subsidized commercial broadcaster, if it is one. Your question about the CRTC kind of chasing digital, I think you have been leaders, in fact, of getting out in front of digital for much of the time that I've followed your work and had occasion to sit underneath these lights. So I don't think that I don't see what you're doing here today and the notice that you put out as a departure from the past role of the Commission. The anxiety that I have is that you appear to be countenancing ideas that would contribute to take money out of the system. And maybe Mr. Armstrong is somebody that I have a lot of confidence in. Maybe he's wrong by 10%. But when you're talking about something in the range of $500 million a year, which is something in the range of a quarter of the system, the Smiths people are telling us that almost 100% lift in their advertising revenues. That frightens me. And then I hear that, and I do have some confidence in your wisdom. I don't imagine that the kind of, I was going to say pick and pay, but out of deference to the chair, I'll say some unbundling notion, that it should have as little deleterious effect as possible to the revenues of the system, because maybe Michael has a conflict of interest from a production association to be talking about money, but I'm here representing something in the range of 300,000 to 400,000 viewers and listeners who actually spend money to enable the work we do, including financing work by Mr. Miller. And I would say to you that we understand the link between the money and the results that are there. And if we're not going to have the production values that will compete on the English side with the Americans, we might as well throw in the towel. Now, there was just one other comment, and that is, and it was referenced by one of your notice documents, and that is how the price, excuse me, of cable packages has been rising much faster than inflation. And it is a concern of ours that you might use your regulatory powers to harness some of that profit and bring it back into the system. You asked me a general question. I've given you a general answer.
That's fine. And it did exactly what I was wanting to do, because now I'd like to talk about the regulatory dial. One option is to do more in the way of regulation, which has positive and negative effects. One is to do nothing, and another option is to do less. So let's start in the middle, where you had said in page 2 of your written submission that, in our view, there's no need to change fundamentally the current regulatory framework for 3 to 5 years. Now, I know that there's a lot of trailing buts to that, buts being, but we think that there should be a rejigging of the appropriations of the BDU spend, that 5%. There's other buts with respect to local television and community, but just in the general term of we don't think anything needs to be done generally for 3 to 5 years. Why do you say that, and what happens in 3 to 5 years when we reach that sunset period that you talk about?
Well, I will stick with the words that I used on behalf of the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting rather than your description of them. But some famous American once said, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." There's an element of that in what we have to say. And I would also say that you have proposed some new regulation of which we greatly approve. For example, the skinny basic idea. And by the way, subject to exactly the caveats that CMPA put forward about children's programming has to be in there. And subject to that, that would be the answer, Mr. Chair, to the first question about what do you like the best in the August 21st document. And so, you are doing more than tinkering, and we are just concerned that you are proposing some things that we consider to be excessively radical and without good evidence. And I guess I would add, in one or two of your comments, I think it was you, Mr. Chair, we're asking questions about the Miller analysis, but the Miller analysis at the very worst is an expert allegation that some of the things you're proposing to do would take significant chunk out of the GDP of this country. I mean, 0.1, 0.2%, something like that. That's not something that a prudent CRTC would do without a lot of care. So what we have proposed, and since I just said it once here today, maybe I'll just repeat, we think that the best thing you could do in this overarching hearing is to identify critical issues and then to proceed on a timeline of your choosing, recognizing all the other things you have to do, to hold more specific hearings about genre, for example, or whatever your list is, and to proceed that way with care. And I did hear with interest in the exchange, I can't remember if it was Blue Ant or CMPA was here, where the chair said, well, maybe you could announce that you intend to do a number of things and then you could space them over time. That would be better than everything all happening by some date in 2015. The main concern, just the essence of the concern is when you do a number of things together, it's, as anybody could tell you in research, you can't isolate the variables, and you don't know what the interaction between the various things would be. And if what you're playing with is not a sandbox, but the Canadian broadcasting system, we urge you to be cautious. That's all.
I think engineers call that exogenous variables, where you've got more variables and constants.
I should have thought of it, Mr. Simpson.
Yeah, well, it's one of those nickel words that I picked up somewhere along the way, but it does seem to fit. Just to restate why I was taking the middle ground, I was not trying to imply that that you had said categorically that nothing needs to change, but it was a direct left. In our view, there is no need to change fundamentally the current regulatory framework for at least 3, if not 5 years. And I was using that as a starting point.
And the adjective fundamental is fundamental.
That's the buts. In this, I think it was actually Mr. Miller who had said that we're moving from a closed to an open system in one of his reports. What's also happening is we're moving from a linear to a nonlinear world. And that in itself brings a whole raft of technological and consumption issues, that some of which Mr. Hennessy addressed. But I'm curious, if this 3 to 5 year window that you're looking at, where you would like to somewhat maintain the status quo with a few tweaks, there's going to be a day where there's going to be a Friends of digital delivery in the future. In other words, if we're moving to nonlinear, do you think broadcasting has a sunset as well? And if so, when do you think that is?
I wouldn't even pretend to give a thoughtful answer to that, but I think it's a lot longer than 3 to 5 years. Okay.
Okay.
And I would urge you to pay attention to the next 3 to 5 years, not to the exclusion, but certainly predominantly in your work, as opposed to a decade or 2 decades hence.
I'd like to now go into the issues of finding more money for the cultural industry and system, and the idea of looking at shifting regulatory burdens. Now, in the area, what I found interesting is that in your view, and I thought it was refreshing, you had said very simply, impose a 10% levy on an OTT such as Netflix. You know, you didn't get into complicated formulas of anything else. You just simply said.
But we did it. And you know, you can't keep everybody's 100-paragraph briefs at the top of your head.
Yeah.
But what we said was, you know, you've got broadcasters where you're putting 30% obligations on them, and you got distributors where you're putting 5% obligations on them. What are some of these companies like? Well, they're somewhere in between. And so we hit upon 10 as what we thought of was at the modest end between 5 and 30, but a reasonable suggestion. But it's only a non-profit organization coming to you with a suggestion. But but we think it's a decent suggestion, and it doesn't matter to us at all that some minister in the Conservative government says nobody's going to tax Netflix. We think it's a good idea, and I would just like to underline for you that the essence of our idea the Netflix contribution would be a fairly modest contribution initially, but it would presumably grow in scale as Netflix grew. And we were talking only about the over the board, not the sneaking in and pretending to be Americans side of things. But we also, and much more significantly, thought that if you look at the portion of the BDU contribution that does not go to the Canadian Media Fund, that there should be a look at the priorities of that other 2% that is currently flowing into, although your rules try to discourage it, cable-controlled local programming. And we thought that it would be a good idea to take a little bit of that money and to help the Smiths people. And we care about those people a lot, and we have a lot of supporters. The poll I mentioned to you was released today, and that's big stuff in St. John's and London and Thunder Bay. And so a little bit of money would help them a great deal.
But let's put them over to one side, because I'm still trying to deal with OTT and digital delivery.
Well, if you want to focus on OTT, I'm your man.
Well, only because the 10% issue is interesting, but interesting because it brings about another question to me, which is, if conventional broadcasters, as they go down this road and they get into the area of other forms of linear delivery via digital means rather than pure cable, even though it seems to come over the same system, if they find themselves needing to compete on a nonlinear OTT platform basis like a Show Me, should they have different regulatory expectations that we place on them, or would it be just simpler to let them fight fire with fire and do what's necessary to be able to compete with a foreign OTT and just pay a straight percentage instead?
I hear you, but it seems to me that the fire with fire metaphor is inappropriate. It's more like charcoal fighting gasoline or something like that. And you, particularly with your statutory responsibilities, should be looking at the equity question between them. A group like the Friends is not going to come here and give you a definitive answer to that question. We are more in the way of trying to urge certain considerations on you, such as, for example, the consideration to temper your near total attention on consumer
well, the reason why I asked the question the way I did is that we have heard over the last 2.5 days, 3 days now, that functionally the broadcasting system is still in relatively good shape, the way it's currently structured. And
the system, yes.
The system, and that on the low side of the 90s, we still have Canadians watching television in the home, in a live environment, not a PVR environment, which I take everyone's word that that's true. So therefore, this OTT outlier, I'm trying to understand whether it's something that is what the industry is going to, or it's simply an anomaly. It's the difference between buffet and a la carte. And do we have to look at it differently than broadcasting? Because I'm assuming that if broadcasting is okay for the 3 to 5 year future that you seem to be saying it is, and others, then is OTT a red herring? And do we just have to look at it as an anomaly? And go ahead,
if I may, Commissioner Simpson, make a crack at this. As you know, and as has been referred to in this proceeding, predicting the precise form of the future is impossible. But there are certain things you can do, and that is you can look after the fundamentals. And the fundamental of the Canadian broadcasting system is a separate Canadian rights market. I did a study on that, and you'll see that there's references to that notion of a separate Canadian rights market throughout most of the submissions in this proceeding. Even Disney comments on it. Now, why is that notion so important? That notion is so important Because if you can have the rights to programming within your territory, if you can profit from foreign programming, if you can protect so that you can profit from domestic programming, it doesn't matter so much how it evolves. You have the programming. Now all you have to do is monetize it. And so one of the things that I believe has troubled so many parties to this proceeding is that some of the key measures the CRTC has in place to protect the Canadian program rights market seem to be on the table. So everything from simultaneous substitution to predominance of Canadian services to the entry rules for foreign services, which you've now actually taken off the table, to issues of access rights. All of those are measures that the CRTC put in place over the course of 30, 40, 50 years to allow the sector to flourish because they help maintain a Canadian rights market. And I think you'll see one of the themes coming from most interventions here is don't mess up with those measures. Something like pick and pay, by contrast, and I believe I even pointed this out in the rights paper, it may have an impact. It may even have a material impact financially. But if it's done okay, it won't have a negative impact on the ability of people to acquire and maintain rights. So these are where the distinctions show. Genre protection, which you know I did a paper for the Commission on, again, an issue with many complexities, and I won't depart from the work I did for the Commission in trying to suggest, you know, whether it should or shouldn't be changed. So those are ones that don't have a fundamental impact. But you change simultaneous substitution, you change predominance of Canadian, you change entry rules of foreign services. You're going to the heart of how the system protects itself and remains Canadian. As long as you don't do that, the business models can evolve. And one of the things that's clear, and this again has been referred to, but I'm not sure it's fully understood, is, as you say, the movement to on-demand is relatively slow. So TVB reports that linear viewing to linear channels, not PVR, not anything else, is still 93% of viewing, which is kind of startling when you think about it. Really? Is it really 93% of viewing? But apparently it is. But as more and more of this viewing goes on demand, because it will. I mean, that's something we can reasonably predict. We don't know exactly how fast it's going to happen, but it is going to happen. Here's the interesting thing. The money's still coming from the linear side. Mm-hmm. And people have referred to this. It's very hard to monetize the on-demand side. So I'll give an example. Take a Treehouse or a White TV. If you ask Chorus, I'm sure they'll be able to tell you that they get an increasing amount of viewing on demand. But where are they making the money? They're making the money from the services, the linear services that are subscribed to. So these are the things that get difficult. So the thing that I would submit, and what I tried to say in the papers, is don't try and predict the future. Don't do, do what the Commission has always done. Be technologically neutral. But be careful which of the things that are played with, because some of the stuff is fundamental to how the system has to evolve.
Some of my, just on a lighter note, some of my colleagues who are not as deep into all of the jargon as certainly they would have had trouble understanding what language was being spoken when Bell was here today. But what one of them said, and this is intended in jest, Mr. Chair, they said one of your predecessors was responsible for doing something really great for the Canadian music industry, and so they named the Juno Awards after him. Tell Jean-Pierre Blais, we don't want you to be the commissioner after whom Blais blackouts are named, okay?
Okay. I'll thaw that.
Yeah.
But thank you for the dissertation, Ms. Miller. We're gonna have to scoot along, and we will get to the reason why you're here, Mr. Morrison. But I just wanted to, where I'm going with this is OTT broadcasting. That's pretty what I'm asking. And as we sort of examine regulatory reach, I'm trying to come in my own mind to where broadcasting ends and content vending via on-demand starts, and whether or not that constitutes a need to examine it in the new.
Well, we think it is, and we have data. And if you wish, I'd be happy to table it. But
yeah.
Anybody in the world can get it from the internet.
Yeah.
That says that Canadians do too.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let's move on to the issue. while I'm going to go first into your recommendations on the public broadcaster, and then talk about community, and then talk about local TV. So first with the public broadcaster, you've inferred, I think you were categoric at one point, and you've modified your position that the CBC really should be getting out of the advertising side of the business because it would help the privates, where admittedly they're a source of funding for public broadcasting. But I ask you, in the course of this whole, the scope of everything we're looking at, is public broadcasting becoming more the ground by which the spirit of the Act, I'm thinking 3.2 here, but the spirit of nation building when the Act was originally built, is public broadcasting carrying more and more of that burden? And do private broadcasters, or should they be carrying the burden of Canadian content to the extent they are, if they're becoming more and more required to be globally competitive?
Well, Canada's national public broadcaster is a feeble public broadcaster by comparison with the public broadcasting that's available in most OECD countries. I don't think I need to give you the details, but that's a fact. And so, and that's because it's become weaker and weaker. Do you recall 2 years ago, we were here before you saying that you shouldn't give the corporation a 7-year license when they were going to lose Hockey Night in Canada in a year or two? So, I mean, we've been following this, and one of the things about the public broadcaster, Commissioner Simpson, is that, and I'm not talking, I'm going to specifically exclude SRC television from this. And as you may know, you can't even find a decimal place to find any economic value from the ads that were allowed by you on Espace Musique and Radio 2. But the English television network has now lost more than half of its revenue stream, and the cost of selling does not go down accordingly. So our estimate is that what was once a 9-digit problem is now in the high 8 digits. And I'm told it's even worse than that, because in cities like Edmonton, the people who used to put ads on Hockey Night in Canada and sort of, you know, put ads on locally on the station there, that's drying up too. And so it's getting to a point where you could contemplate taking away that distorting factor and allow it to be, as other OECD countries have, a public broadcaster rather than a hybrid public-private. And so our thought was that, and I won't repeat the details, they're in the presentation, and also in the brief, but by switching even initially 1% of the BDU contribution over, you would be giving them cash which would create a wash with their advertising net revenues now. And if you know, you'd say, but they're an independent institution, we can't tell them what to do. Or you could say, well, if you accept what we're offering you and guarantee to put it into local programming, you can have $90 million. They would pretty soon come into line. And so those are things, and by the way, the $90 million is a kind of a wash, because the vertically integrated companies would suck up the $90 million in advertising, you know, and that equals the costs. So, so we thought it was something that was modest, attainable, and practical, and it's along with 2 or 3 other suggestions we make.
But in today's terms.
But and
what
then
about 5 years from now? I mean,
and, well, then
profitable private broadcasting creates the money to be to create more robust public broadcasting. And that may be the case today, but you know,
the whole Canadian economy creates that money. We invest about 0.2% of the GDP on public broadcasting in this country. Yeah. But the point I was coming to was that you also, as we have recommended, should be on your own initiative making a report, a public report to government about the state of Canadian television arising out of this. And one of the sections of that report should be that public broadcasting needs to be better financed to pick up the slack. And we know, I know very well, that the current government will not want to hear that. But that's not necessarily the thing that would deter an independent regulator.
Well, I think that it's not so much whether the government wants to hear that, it's just a question of, you know, who pays. And I think, you know, one of the fomenting drivers of this hearing was the concern over what things cost. And it's to that end that I asked my questions.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to the local side of things, you've proposed that community television should have a reframed programming requirement that is 50%, a minimum of 50% public access, and that it be better financed through perhaps an increase in the contributions from the BDUs. But I ask you,
I thought that you'd taken that issue off the table on August 21st, so we tried not to get into it in our statement.
Well, I'm asking it in context to a broader question, which is, do you think that community television has had its day as a public utility?
No, it could be much. It's much more effective in the French language in this country than it is in the English language. It's more effective in other countries. So I don't think there's any kind of deterministic thing. It's just a question of resources. But I stress that we didn't get into that topic because we were trying to respect your priorities.
Mm-hmm. The value of community channels has been local expression, local reflection, and it's been my experience that different BDUs have different views as to how that's done. But notwithstanding that, in the context of the previous statement I made about the viability of commercial broadcasting, we're hearing and seeing evidence that the local side of that industry is under financial stress. Mm-hmm. And you heard Mr. Kroll today saying that it's not his choice, but it may be his need to look at shuttering as many as a third of his local stations.
I think I heard him say 15 out of 30. Maybe I got it wrong.
Maybe I got it wrong, but but notwithstanding that, something is wrong there. And I ask you whether in the way they're looking at having to compete over this next 5 years as a network, whether the local station formula of over-the-air is necessary in order to be a viable private broadcaster in the cable world.
But his answer would come as a businessman running a profit-making organization.
That's what he does.
Responsible to shareholders, and that's his role.
Yeah.
But your role is to ensure that, I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, but my clear recollection is that your own research as part of this process has identified something that I saw Barry Kiefel here earlier today. There's a 10-year chart, I think, in our presentation, which shows that far more than any other type of broadcasting, people care about local news. And our own Nanos research confirms that not only is that the case, Friends has been polling for a long time, but the intensity of that view is higher. So there's an act of Parliament. I would be wasting your time to quote the clause, which mandates the importance of this. So when you have the public wanting it, it being threatened, it being a statute that says it should happen, you know, the word simultaneous substitution come to my mind. Mm-hmm. You should be very careful about what you're doing there.
I will ask a question about that in a minute, but staying with local TV for a minute. When we were looking at saving local TV, which was the rally cry back in 2009, I think.
You mean around the LPIF?
Well, the LPIF came later, but in looking at what local television is and was then and is now, local television or local news is vitally important. But in the scope of a broadcast wheel, it's something like 2 to 3 hours out of the broadcast day, and the rest of it is fundamentally networked that's over the air. And that's why I asked the question the way I do. If 95% of the marketplace is watching a CTV or a global, is it necessary to have the local OTA simultaneously broadcast that over the air for the purpose of being able to deliver 2.5 to 3 hours of news a day? Or is there a different way to do this, looking at the money that's going into community television and the money that's being spent on local OTAs? Your formula had said that independents should receive money, but locals don't. Yet the amount of vertically integrated owned local stations far outnumbers the Smith stations.
Well, you've raised several things. One is that, if you were bargaining with the Kevin Krulls of this world, and I suppose such a thing might just happen at some point, you put simultaneous substitution on the table, and you're even considering maybe taking it off the table, what do you ask for in return? And it seems to me that Canada needs those 30 stations, doesn't it? So I mean, there could be quid pro quos with respect to your comment about whether it's over the air or not. We care about over the air because people who support us care about over the air. It's 5% of Canadians, somewhat higher among francophones than anglophones. That's still the better part of 2 million people. I mean, it's any political party in this country can get 2 million more votes. It also is heavily concentrated among low-income people, and particularly people who've paid their dues, who are on fixed income pensions, and where even $30 is not going to be considered skinny, And so the OTA is an issue, and I think Krull in his comments, if I heard it properly, did talk about the fact that it's over the air creates the opportunity for moving into distant markets through the BDUs, etc. So it's not something that I would hope you would do.
I'm not implying that, and I do agree with you that there's a strong correlation with that 5% to lower income and hardship households. No, what I was more getting at is if funding was available to independent stations, should it not be made available to all local market stations of a certain size?
No, I think you have to take the size of the market is very much important here. You defined the major markets as the 8 big cities. You did that during the LPIF, right?
Yeah.
And so then you're into medium and smaller sized markets. When you're into a market where there's only one source of local news, Barrie, Ontario comes to mind. Would I be right to say? Perhaps not for Kelowna or Kamloops, but in any case, where it's alone, it would be really, really, really important that it be protected. And so something needs to be done. And we were suggesting a modest slice of that 2% of the BDU funds could solve the problem of the Smiths coalition.
Would it be your desire to see at a local level more local programming other than news, if it was possible? Again, I'm going back to the scenario of these two universes right now of community, which is struggling for access, and money to produce content. And I'm looking at local television, which is functionally 2.5 hours of locally originated programming. The rest is network. We, on
our website, is a study that was authored by a man called Arlen Gates, who appeared at the 1998 hearings around the 99 policy, and we presented a study about what's available over the air in Winnipeg in 1986 and 1997. And we should update that study, because back in '86, there was gospel singing and all kinds of things that were local, and it had declined somewhat. But right now, I think we're more preoccupied with stations fading to black, or losing local news entirely than we are with the nirvana that there might be more locally generated content. That's something that would require a larger public investment than appears to be possible in the current environment. And of course, just connecting dots, the role of an empowered Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in picking up the local slack is also something that should be on the table.
Mm-hmm. Moving to programming for a second, and the importance of national and local reflection, there was a very interesting presentation done by Ms. Berkowitz the other day. Did you have a chance to hear or see portions of her presentation?
No, I didn't. I heard about it.
Yeah, well, you know, her thesis was that that in terms of program funding, we perhaps have to rethink the not the merits, but the mechanics of how Canadian content is produced. And her thesis essentially said that we should be preoccupying ourselves more with the idea of rebranding the Canadian brand, looking to produce hits, not just content. And I think, you know, the essence of what she was getting at is that under the system we have, we dig holes in the highway and then create money to fill those holes, but it isn't necessarily part of building a better highway, it's just filling the holes. And I'm wondering if you have a comment on that.
I think I'd contribute the time that would go into that comment to just speeding up your process here today. I'll remain silent. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
But she also said that she believes drama can be a silver bullet for both the broadcaster and the Broadcast Act. And in so many words, what do you think about that statement?
It's the fiction side of the country. It's telling stories that enable people to identify with their own culture. There's so much of the power of drama is Hollywood in this country that, and this affects young people, but people of all ages, that they see a lot more of Miami and Los Angeles on their screens than they ever do of Halifax or Edmonton or Chicoutimi, and it's the drama that affects the emotional side of the brain, the fiction side of the storytelling. It's critical and it's expensive, and that, I guess that brings me around to point one. We mustn't allow the money to creep out of the system. The people that support Michael Hennessy's organization are some of Canada's most creative people, and the stories they tell are critical to the long-term existence of an independent country on the northern half of the North American continent in both official languages.
Thank you. My last question has to do again with your point about moving slowly and carefully, and it's to do with your position on simultaneous substitution. And again, I get back to that comment about the window of 3 to 5 years that you tell us is necessary to review anything we do, because things will have changed significantly by then. There's a point of view that simultaneous substitution, while it's creating revenue that then is portioned back into the production system, which creates Canadian content, there's the inverse view that what it's really doing is that it's consuming inventory in prime time and at the same time just simply monetizing U.S. Productions for the purpose of feeding the Canadian production machinery. Would you comment on that? And does that comment play at all into your view as to why we have to move slowly on it before we, if we were to ever consider removing it?
I understand some glimmer of merit in that comment, but
glimmer's good.
But there's a legal dimension to this. People have paid for this programming. It's been brought into the country. Only with your commission's support has they been able to monetize that, And you'd be giving a huge gift to all of those, you resuscitate all of those broadcasters on the kind of rust belt south of the Canadian border, of course. But it's such an important piece of the system. You would be unwise to tinker with that.
Does that view tie to a view regarding an all-Canadian basic service and putting any American services onto a paid discretionary tier?
The what is it, 1B was our candidate for 1B plus 3 children, and the French equivalent is our. We support that. Mind you, I accept their logic that only a very small portion of Canadians are going to take that. A lot of people will then go beyond, and that's where you get into the all of the other options. And we just urge you with those other options to keep your eye on the gas tank of funds that is being accumulated to be turned into production values.
Housekeeping question: are we to assume then, by Mr. Miller's presence, that that the content of both of his reports you agree with in full, or are there any exceptions?
No, nor disagree. The reason I can't speak for other funders, but Friends of Canadian Broadcasting's investment in both of the Miller studies was our feeling that we weren't sure who else was bringing objective, expert evidence to this table, and we wanted to make that contribution. And we didn't make the contribution. I mean, if we were in that kind of business, we could just write press releases, and we do. But this is different. This is an investment in trying to, and by the way, my colleague, whom I respect greatly, he could be wrong. But the best way to find him wrong would be to commission some other study that says, no, it's the best thing since sliced bread, whatever the proposal is, you know? And so that's why we did it. We thought an evidence-based contribution was of some value and was an investment in the success of your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morrison. I believe those are questions. But before I let you go, you and others have made reference to some noise that's occurring outside this hearing room. I can't prevent that noise occurring outside this hearing room, but what I can assure you is that figuratively, at least, you'll have your day in court. We're not a court, we're an administrative tribunal, and you will, I can assure you, have a fair hearing before us. So thank you for participating in this proceeding.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.